Well, good morning, everybody. It's, as always, a great pleasure to be back in Warsaw. I was reflecting with some startlement on the flight coming over yesterday that I first came to Warsaw 25 years ago, and at a time when it was dark, it was cold, there was nothing in the shops, it smelt of stale tobacco, and whenever I've come back since then, the change has been and continues to be an enormous pleasure. What I want to talk about today is draws to a significant extent on work I've been doing on pensions with Peter Diamond, so I'm stealing from our work together. I want to talk briefly about objectives, then there are so many lessons from economic theory I could talk for hours about them. I will just select one which I think is particularly pertinent. Then I want to spend most of the time saying what are the lessons from policy that I derive from theory, both the theory I talk about this morning and other bits of theory, and then if there's time, a brief conclusion. So objectives, the key point is pensions have multiple objectives. For the individual, consumption smoothing, so that's redistributing from our productive middle years to ourselves when we're older. Insurance has a range of dimensions, but in particular, since when we retire we don't know how long we're going to live, we need insurance against the risk of outliving pension savings. Public policy has additional objectives, in particular poverty relief. So pensions aren't just about consumption smoothing, they're about poverty relief, and pension design has to reflect a balance between them. Lessons from economic theory. The one I want to talk about is that imperfect information and non-rational behavior are pervasive. There's other important lessons that I would talk about if I had time: the importance of administrative costs, the centrality of national output, the way different pension systems share risks differently, the fact that a move from pay-as-you-go towards funding has important transition costs, and not so much a theoretical lesson as a practical lesson that implementation matters. It's all very well having a marvelous design on paper, but making it work in practice is a different and difficult challenge. And I guess the single core conclusion of Peter Diamond's and my long book is that though there are sound principles of pension design, there is no single best pension system for all countries. So that if anybody says, here is the best system and all countries ought to have it, then basically they're wrong. So, imperfect information and non-rational behavior. If you start from the simple world of economic theory, the world of simple economic theory, and say, all right, let people choose how much they save, and then let them choose whether or not to buy an annuity, so we leave it all to people's individual choices. The challenge to that model is whether consumers choose well. There's lessons from the economics of information, there's lessons from behavioural economics. On information economics, there's many areas of social policy where the assumption of that consumers are well informed does not hold. Healthcare is an obvious example. In the context of pensions, there was a survey in which 50% of Americans didn't know the difference between a stock and a bond. Now, if you don't know a distinction as basic as that, to expect people to choose from multiple pension providers is daft. Second piece of imperfect information, most people don't understand the need to shift from equities to bonds as they age. And thirdly, virtually nobody realizes the significance of administrative charges. Do people behave rationally? Well, what simple theory predicts is that we save voluntarily for old age and then we buy an annuity. But that's not the way the world works. People don't do that. Economists talk about two deviations from simple rational behaviour. Bounded rationality arises where the problem is so complicated that people don't really know what to do. So what you see is people delay saving, or you see inertia, people stay where they are. So you sign them up with one pension company and simple theory says, well, they will look across the market and they will move if there's a better offer. The reality is people don't. Bounded willpower arises where people know what it is they ought to be doing, but they don't do it. And if we say, why do people behave that way? Well, recent lessons from behavioural economics explain why. There's a famous experiment in which, as you come in, outside before you came in, you sign up for your snack for next week's seminar. And 2/3 of you choose fruit salad because you know that that's the healthy option, and 1/3 of you choose chocolate. But as you come in through the door, there's a table with fruit salad and chocolate for today's seminar, and 2/3 of you choose chocolate, which says people are rational for the future, but less so in the present. The problem is when the future arrives, it becomes the present. So the short term always dominates the long term. And there's good evidence on this. This is where economic theory meets hard neuroscience. They've done experiments on people, looking at people's brains under the CAT scanner. And it shows that short-term decisions are taken by one bit of the brain, and rational long-term decisions are taken by another bit of the brain. And the two bits are always in conflict. And we have only to look at ourselves to see this. You know, yesterday evening when we came in on our flights, you know, did we have an extra glass of wine, or should it, you know, would it be better to get an early night because we're speaking this morning? You know, giving up smoking, losing weight. There's always good reasons to postpone. So we know about all this. Now the implications for policy design are quite important. First of all, it means that financial education is a good thing and should be encouraged, but there are limits to what it's realistic to expect. This idea that you can turn all of us into financially literate consumers is far too ambitious. And a second implication is that constraining people's choice, giving people less choice, can be part of good policy design. So the mistake to avoid is to say choice and competition is a good thing. Choice and competition is a good thing for smartphones, for clothes, for restaurants. Where things are too complicated, like pensions, choice and competition is the wrong model. Now, that's not a condescending attitude from an elderly professor of economics saying, oh, you know, most people don't understand these things. None of us is allowed to go into the pharmacy and buy whatever pharmaceutical drugs we like. It's controlled, our freedom is restricted for good reason. It's assumed we don't know enough to make sensible choices. I would argue pensions are like that. I don't think any of you is able to choose a good pension fund from 800 competing pension funds as Swedish workers have to. I couldn't do so. I was asked to write a report on the Swedish pension system for the Swedish authorities, and the night before I presented the report, I was having dinner with two old friends in Sweden, both of whom very high up in the Swedish pensions world, both of them deeply knowledgeable, both of them old friends. And I was saying over dinner, I said, if I were a Swedish worker, I wouldn't know how to choose a good fund. I'd be in the default fund. And they looked at me and laughed and said, we're in the default fund. So it's actually helping workers to give them simpler choices. And I will come back to that. So what does that imply for policy? I've said there is no single best pension system for all countries, so I'm not saying these are the answers, you must do them. I'm saying these are 4 policy directions that are interesting and which work well in some countries. I want to start off talking about how you achieve poverty relief through a non-contributory basic pension, increasingly referred to as a social pension, sometimes also called a citizen's pension, which is a public pension paid at a flat rate on the basis of age and residence rather than contributions. So you're saying if you are a Dutch person and you have lived in the Netherlands all your life and you reach retirement age, you get a pension irrespective of your contributions. So you've got a non-contributory element, and then on top of that, and I'll come to that, you've got a contributory element as well. What are the arguments for a system like that? Well, the real argument is the world has changed. If you look at the world of 1950, post-World War II, social policy was based on a series of assumptions which I've listed there: independent nation states, employment generally full-time and long-term, relatively little international mobility, stable families where men and women got married and stayed married, and the man earned the money and the woman looked after the children, things like that. Now, those assumptions weren't strictly true even then, but they were good enough for effective social policy. And of course, what's changed, you've only got to list them to see how none of them holds today. 2 in particular which have changed is, it's no longer the case that most people are employed full-time for most of their career. There's much more diverse patterns of work, which means if you have a system where pensions are based on employment-related contributions, you're going to get incomplete coverage. A separate issue is the changing nature of the family. Family structures are more fluid. You have more couples that are not married. You have people get married but then get unmarried and may remarry. You have rising labour market activity by women, not just part-time employment, but women having careers. So for both reasons, the 1950s idea that you can base a woman's pension on her husband's contribution, I mean, it seems a bizarre idea seen through today's eyes, but at least in 1950 it sort of worked, whereas today it simply doesn't. So the argument for a non-contributory pension is better coverage, improved poverty relief, possibly improved incentives relative to an income-tested poverty relief pension, and some capacity to be robust in the face of shocks, because anything that's tax-financed can share risks more widely across generations. Now, what I've said so far, the idea of a pension for everybody, makes ministers of social security happy, but drives ministers of finance nuts. You know, they say, who is this guy? He's a lunatic. He doesn't understand fiscal realities. The way you make non-contributory pensions affordable is you've got the level of the monthly pension, but importantly, you've also got the age from which the monthly pension is first paid. So there are ways of having a proper non-contributory pension within what is fiscally affordable. Quite a few countries have these, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Australia, Canada and Chile, for example. My own country, the UK, illustrates the problems of the contributory principle. With today's labour markets, even if you have effective administration, you're going to have incomplete coverage. And in 2005, of British people who retired in 2005, I think only 85% of men had the 40 plus years of contributions they needed for a full state pension. 85% of men and 30% of women. So the contributory principle doesn't work for poverty relief anything like as well as it used to. So that's my first policy direction. Secondly, if you want to pay pensions that are adequate and you want systems that are sustainable, how do you do it? And the answer is you have later and more flexible retirement. Now, I needn't bang on about the reasons why later retirement is a good idea. If you were asked to design a pension system for a brand new planet and you were told that the dominant native life form was living longer and longer, you would never, in your right mind, design a pension system with a fixed retirement age. You would say retirement age ought to bear some sensible relation to life expectancy. And if you had if when pensions were invented in the 19th century, they hadn't chosen a retirement age of 65, but they tied it to life expectancy, there wouldn't be any talk about the pensions crisis today. It's not only later retirement isn't desirable only for reasons of sustainability. A lot of people don't want necessarily to retire at 60 or 65. It's interesting that in Britain, where we had a retirement age of 65 for men and 60 for women, we are moving towards equalising the retirement age. The reason we're equalising the retirement age for women is not that our Treasury mandated that this should happen in order to cut public spending. It was British women going to the European Court of Human Rights, arguing that they were being discriminated against by being forced to retire at a younger age from men. So a lot of people don't want to retire at 65 necessarily. Now, it's not just later retirement, it's also more flexible retirement. And time is running short, and I know we're going to hear more about this later, but I think the model where you reach retirement age and then your hours drop to zero is batty. It makes much more sense to have a system where people can move from full-time work to full retirement along a time path of their choosing. So later and more flexible retirement is my second policy direction. The third one is, if consumption smoothing, simple savings and annuities. And I've argued that choice and competition is the wrong model because it's all too complicated. So the implications for pension design is, one, make pensions mandatory or use automatic enrollment. Two, keep choices simple. Give workers choice from a very small number of funds, say 5 or something like that. Include a default option for workers who don't choose, and keep administrative costs low by separating two aspects of pensions. On the one hand, who does the account management, the back office stuff, and that should be centralized. A second aspect is the fund management, who decides what assets to buy with your pension savings. And if you centralize administration and give workers a lot less choice, you can make administration a lot cheaper. And there are examples of this, the oldest one being the thrift savings plan in the United States, which has got exactly those characteristics. Workers are automatically enrolled, they choose from 5 funds, there's centralized account administration and wholesale fund management. Time is running out, so the second approach to consumption smoothing that makes sense are notional defined contribution pensions. In Poland, of all places, you don't need me to explain to those how they work. Peter Diamond and I are currently working on another book where we are exploring the properties of a partially funded NDC system where you can use the fact that you've got a large buffer fund, it's partially funded, to smooth over short-run turbulence. So you have a system that adjusts automatically to long-run change, like demographic change, but which can smooth over short-run turbulence. So you get some risk sharing built in. Okay, just a few conclusions. First of all, consumer choice in pensions should be optimised, not maximised, and I'm arguing the optimal degree of choice is very limited. You can have as much choice as you like in the voluntary, for voluntary pensions, third-tier pensions, the mandatory second-tier pension. If you've got a system with choice, it should be limited. Secondly, there's a wide range of options for pension design, and the better your economic and institutional capacity, the wider that range of options is, but more complex is not necessarily better. New Zealand has a very simple system with a social pension based on age and residence, and after that, auto-enrollment in simple, cheaply administered savings schemes. It's a very simple system. That's by choice, not constraint. They could run more complicated systems. They choose not to. So, final point, people sometimes say to me, what really matters for pensions? And my argument is, only two things matter, really. One is output growth. You need enough output to satisfy the demands of workers and pensioners simultaneously. And the other is good government. If you've got good government, they will run pay-as-you-go systems responsibly. They will create the macroeconomic and prudential reliability which private pensions need. So it's actually much less a question of pension design, for which there are many options, than of trying to get good government. And if anybody knows how to do that, please would you tell me so that I can publish it and claim my Nobel Prize. Thank you very much.